So Pokemon Legends ZA introduces some pretty big lore reveals, and I wanted to talk about those in a video to kind of just cover the major things we learn about from this game in terms of both the lore of the Kalos region as well as just the Pokemon world in general. And there's one in particular that is really big in my opinion, and I really want to get into it on a deeper level. So to start, we're going to go over some smaller things and some things that are a little more obviously presented in the game, and then we're going to get into this big discussion about a certain couple of legendary Pokemon. Also, it kind of goes without saying with a video like this, but there will be spoilers discussed throughout this video for Legends ZA, so consider yourself warned if you decide to keep watching. To start though, like I said, one of the big establishing things about this game, in terms of lore that this game reveals, is that Legends ZA is set 5 years after Pokemon X and Y. This is alluded to all throughout the game, so it's pretty obvious and you're gonna know that this is a thing as you simply play. And this is really important because what it tells us is roughly where this game takes place, not only in relation to X and Y, but also in relation to other games as well. In fact, we could roughly say that this takes place roughly after the conclusion of the Alola games, I would say, and we also know that the Alola games did in fact take place roughly 2 to 3 years after the events of X and Y. So this leaves ZA taking place roughly 2 to 3 years after the events of the Alola games. So in a way, these games are kind of like sort of pseudo-sequels to each other, with X and Y being a prequel to ZA, and those two are obviously connected, and then ZA kind of being adjacent in terms of not exactly being a sequel, but being what happens next within the pantheon of the Pokemon timeline, which is going to be important as we get into some of these other points. But yeah, that is a really good thing to know as kind of an establishing thing for the events of this game. Another thing that's also really crazy that doesn't really relate to what's going on in Kalos, but it does relate to the previous Legends game, which is Legends Arceus, and that is the fact that Volo is basically confirmed to still be alive, and it is also confirmed that Ingo, who fell through a time portal back to the land of Hisui, as we learned in Legends Arceus, apparently made it back home to his own time. In Ingo's case, it is alluded to by some NPCs that the multi-train is back up and running again, which obviously implies that he is back in the Unova region in this time to allow it to happen. Ingo is also mentioned by name as well, and it is also mentioned at the exhibit at the Lumiose Museum that he basically decided one day that it was time for him to return to his own time. So however he did it, I don't know, but it does seem to be the case that Ingo has made it back to the current day, which I really hope we get to learn a little more about someday, and hopefully actually get to see Ingo and just learn how all that went down, because it seems like he might have some kind of understanding of time travel if he's able to just kind of decide it's time for him to go back and then actually make it back. So that is definitely something I would like to know more about. In the case of Volo, it is mentioned by a guy at the Lumiose Museum when viewing an exhibit on Volo's outfit that we see him wearing in Legends Arceus. This guy says that this outfit, which we know to be Volo's, was donated to the museum personally, which basically implies that Volo is still alive to have recently donated to this to the museum, which we also know to have happened in recent times, because it's also mentioned that the Hisui exhibit is a temporary thing within the museum, so it hasn't been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's a recent addition, and a temporary one at that. So Volo is walking around somewhere in the modern day Pokemon world. And this was kind of also alluded to by him in Legends Arceus itself, where he kind of made mention of being determined to meet Arceus, even if it meant having to travel through time and space and that kind of thing. So turns out he found a way to keep going and travel through time, and it would also obviously be very, very interesting to see him in a future game, to see where he's at in terms of his overall plan. I would love if in the next Legends game we either get another allusion to him, or maybe get a chance to see him working on that goal. Like maybe while we're in another region just doing our own thing in the next Legends game, we get to see a small glimpse of him where he's traveled to this region in pursuit of maybe some information or something that could help him along his goal to meet Arceus, even if it is just so far gone after the events of Legends Arceus. That would be really cool, but either way, it's really insane to know that Volo is still alive. Speaking of people who are still alive though, Lysandre is still alive after all of those years of wondering whether he ended up dead or immortal, and it actually is confirmed that as a result of the ultimate weapon firing, which is why we were unsure about Lysandre's fate in the first place, Lysandre himself does confirm in the post-game of ZA that he himself is now immortal and basically takes the place of AZ as the person who is next going to wander the earth for 3,000 years. It's also confirmed how he survived that ultimate weapon blast, because Lysandre himself mentions that Zygarde saved him when the ultimate weapon went off, and that's basically how he was able to get out of there alive. That has been one of the great Pokemon mysteries since Pokemon X and Y came out, so I absolutely love, and I just cannot state enough how much I love that they resolved this mystery and they brought Lysandre back and included him as not only a character in this game, but a very important one. This one was an absolutely awesome lore revelation. Now I'm about to get into the really crazy stuff, but as I do, just a really quick shout out to the merch store. If you enjoy my content, consider picking something up with the link in the description, as it immensely helps the content to continue happening. There's super soft and squishy plushies, there's super awesome fun trading cards, the Fulkachi plush even comes with a limited edition trading card too. It's just all really awesome. Again, check that out with the link in the description. It's super helpful. Thank you guys a ton for the support, and now back to the video. And now we get into the big part of the video, which is basically the focus of what I wanted to talk about here, and that has to do with Zygarde and its connection to Necrozma. This is something that is actually really crazy, because outside of Zygarde visiting the Alola region in Sun and Moon, there's never really been an implied connection between Zygarde and Necrozma. They just have kind of been two legendary Pokemon. But Lysandre, in the post-game of ZA, after you catch Zygarde, he essentially offers up what is an explanation as to why Zygarde was in Alola in the first place, because as we know, it was kind of just shoved into Sun and Moon, and on the real life side of things, we all knew that that was because Pokemon Z got canceled, but they still wanted to make use of and introduce complete Zygarde and its 10% form, so they just threw it into the Alola games, basically just as like an unrelated piece to that game that they just threw in there anyway and just made it work. It did kind of feel a little bit messy at the time, but what's crazy here is that they are now explaining that in terms of Pokemon lore and why it actually happened, because Lysandre, after you catch Zygarde in the post game, mentions that Zygarde was in the Alola region because it had used up so much of its energy protecting other Pokemon from the ultimate weapon, and afterwards its cells scattered to far off lands, that being Alola, to recover and in search of people that would help give it aid so it could recover. And that is why I mentioned earlier about the fact that Sun and Moon takes place 2 to 3 years after the events of X and Y, because that now lines up in terms of an actual timeline. We get the events of X and Y, and then Zygarde flees Kalos and goes to Alola Alola in order to recover, and then we get the events of Sun and Moon and what happens there with gathering Zygarde cells and bringing them back all together so that it can become its 50% form and then eventually its complete form. So the humans that it was searching for to give it aid were us as the player characters in Sun and Moon, which, like I said, even though on the real life side of things that was just a messy last second inclusion because of the cancellation of ZA, it has now been explained in lore why that actually happened, and I actually think it's a pretty solid explanation that makes a lot of sense. So it's actually really, really insane. In terms of the connection to Necrozma though, this is where it gets really, really crazy, because Lysandre makes a last second mention while you're talking to him after catching Zygarde that Zygarde's new move that it can learn when it mega evolves, which is a move known as Nile Light, it reminds him, as he says in his own words, of the Z moves that are used in the Alola region. And the way that he says this basically implies that there is a connection between Zygarde knowing this move and the Z move itself. And the way I am taking it, and it is just kind of implied in game, it's not outright stated verbatim, but there definitely is something that is being implied here, and what I believe that is the fact that Zygarde was able to learn this move because it absorbed power from Necrozma while in the Alola region, because if Nile Light is basically Zygarde's own personal Z move, once again as is implied by Lysandre, we also know concerning Z moves that they are the result of Necrozma's light being kind of rained down on the Alola region, and that is where the Z crystals come from, and the Z crystals are pieces of Necrozma itself that when Pokemon and people utilize them with the Z-Ring, they're able to use these super powered moves. So Nile Light being kind of like a pseudo Z move for Necrozma, and this implication by Lysandre basically implies that Zygarde absorbed some power from Necrozma while it was in the Alola region, and it gave it this new ability to be able to have this brand new move. And that is basically confirmed when you consider the name of the move itself, Nile Light, with Light obviously being a central figure in terms of the plot of the Alola games and the whole entire concept and just direction of Necrozma as a Pokemon. That's where its power comes from, and that's where the power of the Z moves and Z crystals come from, is Necrozma's light. So the fact that Zygarde's new move is named Nile Light basically is like the confirmation that this is what's going on, that Zygarde has absorbed the power of Necrozma during its time in Alola to grow even stronger, which is absolutely crazy. And concerning the implication that Zygarde going to Alola to search for people to give it aid is the reason why it is able to achieve its complete form, because as we saw in the Alola games, it got that aid, and the Alola games are also where we saw complete Zygarde for the first time. This influence of the Alola region on Zygarde and the implication that it has also absorbed some power from Necrozma in the process seems to potentially be implied even further when you look at complete Zygarde itself, because on complete Zygarde's chest is a small little strip of various colors, and people have noted for a long time that it seems to have the colors of not only the Kalos legendary Pokemon, Xerneas and Yveltal, but also the Alola legendary Pokemon, Solgaleo and Lunala, which kinda seemed to symbolize Zygarde's presence in both of these regions, and again, this is something that people have speculated and noticed and theorized on for years, but no one really had the true answer as to what was going on. Well, it seems like ZA has finally given us the answer. The reason why this seems to be a facet of complete Zygarde's design is because it gained the ability to achieve its complete form after recovering in the Alola region, which we saw during the events of Sun and Moon, and because it absorbed some of Necrozma's power in the process while it was there. So this revelation by Lysandre basically brings the Zygarde Alola arc, if you will, full circle, and basically explains what was going on with one of the most random inclusions in the Alola games, and also one that felt really messy from a development perspective. But honestly, despite that messiness at the time, I think this serves as an excellent explanation for everything that has gone on with Zygarde to this point, and I think it completely legitimizes that time in Alola that it spent, even if it did feel random, because now I think this explanation just not only makes sense, but it serves to justify why that happened in the first place. And I think this just ties up all of those loose ends really, really well. It makes it make sense, and it doesn't feel random or messy anymore. It just feels really, really cool, and I think it just adds so much more to not only Zygarde as a Pokemon, but also the Alola region, its time there, and also Necrozma too. One last point about Necrozma, because there is just a really interesting connection with Necrozma, not only to Zygarde, but also to the Kalos region as a whole. Because in the same way that Zygarde is connected to the Alola region, it seems that Necrozma could also be connected to the Kalos region as well, because we know Necrozma to be the light Pokemon. We also know it to be the Prism Pokemon, which is what it's primarily based around. And what do we find within the Kalos region and in Lumiose City specifically? We find Lumiose City, first and foremost, which is known as the City of Light, and at the center of this city is Prism Tower. So this is essentially a city that thematically perfectly aligns with Necrozma as a Pokemon, which also serves as the setting of this game, and it's where we learn that Necrozma has a major connection to Zygarde. And even though that's kinda where the concrete connections stop between the Kalos region and Necrozma, it seems like there is a ton of connective tissue here, in the same way that there was a ton of connective tissue between Zygarde and Alola, and we now know the explanation behind that story and the fact that there was a story to be told there in the first place. So while it seems from this point forward connections between Necrozma and Kalos are gonna be theoretical because there's really nothing more in the game itself to go on, it does very much seem like a similar situation and that there could be more to talk about there. So hopefully there will be future revelations like we just saw with Zygarde and Alola that will tell us more about this story. But the story that we did learn in ZA with Zygarde, with Necrozma, with the Alola region is an absolutely massive revelation that I personally just thought was a treat. I thought this was such a cool inclusion that they didn't necessarily have to include in the game, but they did, and it just adds so much more depth to these Pokemon and to the events of the Pokemon world. I personally loved it, and now I want to know what you guys think about this revelation, and if you have any other theories or ideas or thoughts about this as well. Thank you so much for watching. I really, really appreciate it. I hope you're enjoying your time with ZA. Leave a like on the video if you enjoyed. Subscribe for more content very, very soon, and until the next one, as always, once again, thank you for watching, and I will smell you guys later.